My talk today is based on the recently published book, The Badge of a Freemason, Masonic Aprons from the Scottish Rite Masonic Museum and Library. And so the aprons that are in the talk that I'm going to give are all in the collection at the museum in Lexington, Massachusetts. Soon after the museum was founded in 1975, the collection began to grow. And Masonic aprons were there from the beginning. They were among the first donations. So today, the museum has more than 500 examples, which is one of the largest collections of Masonic aprons in the world. And I did just want to mention that the museum has been very active in the past couple of years with digital initiatives. And if you have not been to the website, which I'll have at the end, I encourage you to take a look. There are online collections, online exhibitions. There's quite a bit of information that's available online. When I started at the museum, I was there for about 10 years, I was really drawn to the aprons. I have a background as a textile curator, and so the aprons were a way for me to get into the Masonic material culture. And I have always been very interested in objects and things to study history. So it was really my dream project to be able to work on the book. And as I looked very closely at these aprons, I noticed a lot of interesting stories about the users, about the makers, and then also about Masonic aprons in general. What can we learn from history, Masonic history, American history? About those. So I'm going to go through and share some of those stories with you. And I will just say that they are all American aprons because that's really the focus of the museum's collection. But I hope that with that same English background that both America and Canada have, I hope that you will be able to see some similarities and perhaps apply some of what I talk about to Canada as well. So as many of you may know, the fraternities' aprons are inspired by the protective work aprons that were worn by working stonemasons during the 1600s and 1700s. And I did arrange the book chronologically because I wanted to show that evolution in style and shape and design over time. So during the early period, in the mid and late 1700s, most Masonic aprons were made out of leather, and they retained the shape of the animal that they were made from, with ties that extended at the top that were formed from the leg-shaped pieces of the leather. And they also were a longer shape than we're used to today, again, coming from the work aprons that inspired them. The body of the apron could often, in that early period during the early 1700s, reach down to the wearer's knees. And you can kind of see that in some of these early engravings where the aprons are at their knees. So one of the first things that really kind of perplexed me as I went through the collection at the Scottish Rite Masonic Museum and Library is that there weren't very many aprons from the 1700s. Pre-1790 aprons are very rare, and pre-1770 aprons are even rarer. So if anyone knows of a really great documented example of Masonic apron from the 1730s or 40s or 50s, please see me after. I would really love to know about it. This is the oldest apron in the book, and it's, I think, the oldest apron in the museum's collection. And you can see it's got several hand-drawn Masonic symbols, including the representation of Solomon's temple at the top. So that banner along the bottom reads, "Wisdom, fair goddess, we pursue, and virtue always have in view. Let critics sport and fools deride, masons alone in strength confide. Beauty to us her right imparts, we keep them locked within our hearts." So this apron was used on the North Shore of Massachusetts. It was originally owned by a man in the town of Marblehead. And he was a charter member of Philanthropic Lodge when it formed in 1760. And he was the lodge's master in the late 1770s. The apron design seems to have been popular with Freemasons in New England. There are two others with this design that are known. One was used in Providence, Rhode Island in the early 1820s. And in 1781, the members of Essex Lodge in Salem, Massachusetts, presented an apron with this design to Brother John Collins in thanks for providing safe passage for another Freemason on his voyage to the West Indies. So another thing that I found really interesting as I got into this project was that during the 1700s and the early 1800s, one apron could be worn for meetings of different Masonic groups. And this was something that really came to me over time because I was so ingrained with today, where it's very regimented how aprons look and which group you wear them for. But you start looking at these early Masonic aprons, and there was really very little in the way of rules about what they were supposed to look like. And so this one you can see has the red and the blue trim, which may suggest that it was worn in the Blue Lodge for the first 3 degree rituals, as well as at Royal Arch Chapter ritual. And it's also interesting that it's got the red Maltese cross and then those black patriarchal crosses with the little curved curlicues at the end, because I see those and I think Knights Templar. And in Massachusetts, in the United States, the Royal Arch Chapters and the Knights Templar commanderies really weren't formalized until the 18-teens and 1820s. So prior to that, all of these degrees were conferred in the lodge, and so there weren't those formal divisions that exist today. This is a second example of this same trend. This one dates to the early 1800s, 1805 to 1815, and the central emblem is from the seal of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts. But you can again see that it's got a Knights Templar symbol down there. And it suggests, again, that perhaps the owner wore it to both kinds of meetings. So this is one of my favorite points to make, that inscriptions and family stories are not always correct, especially when they involve famous people. So I'm going to start at the top, well, at least for American Freemasons, in terms of famous American Freemasons, George Washington. There are two aprons that are documented that are known to have been owned by Washington. I'll just say that again, two. Neither one of them, sadly, is in the collection in Lexington. However, I used to hear from people at least once a year with aprons that Washington wore. This one was one of those, and it came to us with that story that Washington owned it. And it had a very detailed family history, but when I looked at it, I knew immediately that it's from the 1820s or the 1830s. And Washington, of course, died in 1799. So I never did quite figure out where the Washington connection came from, because the family history didn't start till about the 1860s. And they even weren't really clear. So unfortunately, I don't know how that sort of got started, but a lot of wishful thinking, I think. So this one is another example. This one was passed down in the Irwin family of Louisiana before the museum purchased it in 1989. And according to the family history, Isaac Irwin traveled with the Marquis de Lafayette when he traveled from New Orleans to Nashville. And so Lafayette made a very big tour through the US in 1824 and 1825, and he went all up and down the East Coast. And he was feted by many, many Masonic groups, and he received many Masonic honors. And so the family story with this says that Isaac Irwin traveled with the party from New Orleans to Nashville. And when Lafayette was in Nashville, he attended a Masonic meeting with Irwin. And at the end of the evening, Irwin told Lafayette that his wife was pregnant, and if she had a boy, they would name him Lafayette. So in response, Lafayette reportedly took off this apron, handed it to Irwin, and said, "Here, give him this in memory of me, and perhaps it will at some time serve to recall my visit." So again, really great story. Verifying the details is pretty challenging. However, unlike that Washington apron that I showed you, This one does support that family story. It dates to the early 1820s. There's an inscription at the bottom that says, engraved by Jervis Cutler, Nashville, dedicated to the lodges in Tennessee. So it was also in the right location at the right time for Lafayette to have worn it. And Cutler, the engraver, had settled in Nashville in the early 1820s. And he was also a Mason. Nashville Lodge number 37 admitted him in June of 1825. He also, as you can see in the slide, is in an engraved plate from a book called the Masonic Manual that was written by the Grand Master of Tennessee at the time, and Cutler is the one who also engraved that. So Lafayette came to Nashville in May of 1825, and they had a big celebration, a big meal, and Isaac Irwin, who owned this apron, doesn't appear in any of the records I could look at. But it's possible that he was there. And genealogical records confirm that Irwin did have a son named Lafayette, but he was born 4 years later in 1829. The story that I've just told about Isaac Irwin and Lafayette in Tennessee is bolstered by the existence of this apron. This one is in the collection of the Grand Lodge of Massachusetts, and it was worn by Lafayette in Boston when he assisted with laying the cornerstone of the Bunker Hill Monument on June 17, 1825. And at the end of the banquet, following the ceremony, Lafayette gave this apron that he was wearing to one of the marshals who had assisted him that day. And so that is this apron. And so there's some truth here. So I'm going to leave it to you to be your own history detectives and make your decisions about the other apron. So another thing I learned from looking at all of these aprons is that there was a lot of overlap in design. During the 1700s and the early 1800s, there was no copyright in the US, and apron makers could and did use other people's designs. And not just from other aprons, but from all kinds of different objects. So this apron shows an arrangement of symbols that resembles a lot of other aprons, tracing boards, certificates. And you can see here, these are just some examples of the other types of objects that apron designers used as inspiration. So again, this is another one with kind of a good story. So when you look at this apron, and you can see that they're pretty similar. Those designs are pretty similar. So the one on the right is by James Porter of Middletown, Connecticut, and it's pretty common in New England. You see that apron a lot. So you look at the one on the right, and it looks pretty close, almost like the same apron maybe. And it also looks printed, but it's actually embroidered. So this will become important. And hopefully you can see this. This printed one over here, this says designed and engraved by a brother, Middletown, Connecticut. Can anyone read this? Yeah, it's gobbledygook. It's not your eyes, it's gobbledygook. This other apron, so this apron, it was made in China and brought back. So again, very free with the design. A ship captain from New England probably took a printed example or had some kind of drawing and commissioned a Chinese embroiderer to make the Chinese apron. And then they could come back and say that they had familiarity with that kind of design. And again, this apron is painted, but you can see the very strong resemblance with this printed certificate, just showing, again, more of the inspiration that these objects offered. And again, hopefully you're seeing the pattern here. These look pretty similar. And they all relate to an apron that came from a man named Edward Horseman in Boston. And even after his death, Horseman's apron continued to sell. It was very popular in Massachusetts. The Grand Lodge there described his design as a judicious selection of the emblems of the order, arranged with taste and propriety. The museum and library in Lexington has 5 Horseman aprons in its collection alone, and I've seen many more in different lodges around Massachusetts and New England. So this is the Horseman apron on the right, which is the inspiration for these other 3. And again, you can see how close they are. Example. And this one I just want to mention because the one on the left is painted. It's actually by an artist named Charles Codman, who we know was in Portland. And he did an apprenticeship in Boston earlier in the 1800s, and so he did an apprenticeship with an artist who was a Mason, so it's quite possible that he knew about the horseman apron, and that's where he got that inspiration. And again, another point that really came out after looking at a lot of aprons is that women made many of the Masonic aprons that were used during the early 1800s. And it's no surprise that women were involved in Freemasonry in the early 1800s, even as they are now. Not so much as members, but in terms of helping their family members by stitching an apron, or helping their husband learn his part in a ritual, or raising money to support activities at the lodge. This apron was originally owned by a man named John Tarbell of Cambridge, Massachusetts. And when the apron was purchased by the museum in 1996, it had a handwritten note that read, "Masonic apron was painted and embroidered by his niece." So I did a little digging because, again, you can never trust those notes. Sometimes they're right and sometimes they're not. And Tarbell did have 5 nieces, and the oldest was born in 1808, while the youngest was born in 1820. He was elected as master of his lodge in December 1821, and so that could have merited a new apron. So in 1821, his 2 oldest nieces were 13 and 11, so it's possible one of them made this apron. He also had 3 daughters, and his oldest daughter was born in 1809, so she would have been 13, and it's possible she made this apron. We'll never know, but it's possible. Additional evidence also shows that there were women who were in the business of making aprons. And this is one of my favorite examples. I have to thank my research intern because she's really the one who kind of started the ball rolling and turned up the advertisements that helped us solve this. These each have a label on the back for A. Cisco of Baltimore. And my intern, Ashley, she found an advertisement in Baltimore's Sun newspaper in 1846 that read, "The business heretofore conducted by Mr. Charles Cisco, deceased, late of the city in the variety and fancy trimming manufacturing business, is and will continue to be carried on as usual by the undersigned, who being thankful for the patronage so liberally bestowed upon her late husband, respectfully solicits a continuance of the same." And so the ad goes on to convey that Anne Cisco, A. Cisco, would continue to manufacture all kinds of regalia suitable and appropriate to the different orders. So her husband had earned a living as a coachmaker, which explains how he was so familiar with trimmings that he would sell. In 1839, he had become a Freemason. He was also an Oddfellow and joined the Red Men. I think it was a little bit of business networking to sell some of the things he sold. But unfortunately, he passed away in 1846 when he was 35, leaving Anne a widow with 5 small children. So like many widows who were left with a family to look after, Anne took over running her husband's business. It's quite likely that she had been assisting him all along so that she had a grounding in the elements of the business. And when you look through the newspapers in Baltimore in the 1840s, she had regular advertisements under A. Cisco, Mrs. A. Cisco. In 1847, she advertised Oddfellows, Masonic, Sons of Temperance, and Redmen's regalia of every description. Those in want of regalia for the above-named societies will do well to give me a call before purchasing elsewhere, as I have now a large and complete assortment on hand, which I will sell on the most pleasing terms. In November 1847, she married again to a man who was a merchant. And at the time of the 1860 United States Census, he was listed with a personal estate worth $4,000, while Anne Cisco listed real estate valued at $25,000 in 1860. So she did okay for herself. By 1862, she seems to have retired from the business, and in May that year, advertisements at the same address start appearing for Cisco brothers, her sons, Charles and John. And this is another one of my favorite stories from the collection. I had come across a reference in March 1912, in the New England Craftsman, which is a Masonic magazine that was published in Boston. And it noted that one of the city's regalia makers had recently changed storefronts and reminded readers that the owner is recognized as an authority on correctness of design for the costumes of every period. But it was not a brother Freemason. It was a notice referring to Miss Rose Lipp. Lipp maintained her business in Boston over at least 30 years, providing aprons, jewels, and uniforms, Masonic and fraternal uniforms. Unfortunately, I've had a really hard time finding good data about her. It's very piecemeal, and a lot of it comes from her advertisements. She noted that orders would be promptly executed, and she seems to have traded on her ability to make the aprons and regalia quickly with a high level of quality. So in 1918, the officers of Faith Lodge in Charlestown, which is part of Boston, presented this apron to Theodore Tufts. And so the past master symbol, of course, signifies the occasion that the lodge was commemorating his term as master of his lodge. And this is another favorite of mine from the collection. And again, one of the things that started to become apparent to me the more I looked at the aprons is that good craftsmen recognized a good market when they saw one. In 1820, Joseph Negus wrote to his younger brother, artist Nathan Negus, from Georgia, "I am now about painting a few Masonic aprons and think of getting initiated a member of that ancient fraternity, perhaps in this place if I remain here long enough to establish my character." So Nathan, the younger brother, had painted this apron in 1817 when he was a 16-year-old apprentice in Boston with John Rideau Penniman, who was an artist and a Freemason. And Negus had been familiar with Freemasonry prior to his apprenticeship. His father had been a Freemason, and when his father had died in 1816, Nathan was only about 15 years old, but he did remember the Masonic funeral service that was held for his father. And Negus painted many Masonic aprons when he was an apprentice with Penniman from 1815 to 1820. He left a couple of books, kind of day books, where he noted what he was working on, and it's a really great resource to learn about the process of making Masonic aprons in Boston in the early 1800s. A second Royal Arch chapter, St. Paul's, had formed in Boston in 1818, so its members needed new aprons, and it looks like a lot of what Negus was doing in the late 18-teens as an apprentice was painting aprons for some of those two chapters in Boston. Nathan, when he finished his apprenticeship, went down to Georgia to join his brother, and among his first jobs in his daybook is painting aprons for Israel K. Teft and a Mr. Spofford. And Nathan and his brother also started painting the Milledgeville, Georgia Masonic Hall. And they did become Freemasons. Unfortunately, Nathan would not be able to reap the benefits of his growing professional experience and Masonic connections. He fell ill in 1825 and went home to Massachusetts. Just 24 years old, he reached home and died 4 days later. But I think that's also why his things got saved, his daybooks and some letters. So I guess it's a silver lining, I don't know, to a young death. But thankfully, some of these craftsmen who benefited from the Masonic market have less tragic stories. This is an apron that's signed on the back by an artist named R.B. Kraft, who was an itinerant artist in the Midwestern US. And we don't think he was a Freemason himself, but he did paint portraits, decorative items, and at least one other Masonic apron, which is now in the Folk Art Museum in New York City. That's the same design as this one that's in Lexington. And again, this one takes advantage of that Masonic market. This one I like because both the maker and the owner were Freemasons. Maker Nathan Lakeman and owner Charles Peabody belonged to Jordan Lodge in Danvers, Massachusetts. And this one has a label on the back that says painted by Lakeman and Hooper and gives their address in Salem, Massachusetts. Again, unfortunately, Lakeman, who was the maker of this apron, died of consumption in 1835 at just 31 years old. But apron owner Charles Peabody lived a much longer life and did not die until 1875 when he was 77. And I think for a lot of people, when you start looking at these early aprons, the colorful nature really jumps out. And I, again, from my background in looking at a lot of different types of objects, Masonic, non-Masonic, it became very clear to me that these colorful aprons were part of a larger American trend in the early 1800s that's known as American fancy. And I guess I was a little slow to kind of say, well, of course, why wouldn't Masonic objects fit into that same style? And you start looking at these early aprons and you can see the color and the sparkle and just how bright they are. And it becomes more interesting because the fancy style is also rooted in Enlightenment thinking, just like Freemasonry is. One definition suggests that fancy signified almost any activity or object that delighted the human spirit or stirred the imagination. And so the bold colors and the bright patterns attracted attention and were considered very pleasing. And fancy objects were intended to elicit emotions and expand the imagination. And I don't think it's a big leap to kind of put that into the meaning of the symbols that are on these aprons and what they're supposed to remind Freemasons of. I think it's a style that works well with the functional use. And so this one, I don't know anything about this apron, who made it, who wore it, but it definitely does exemplify the bright colors and the gold symbols and the layers of decoration with that fancy style. And then this is just an example of some of the other types of objects that, again, had that fancy style from the same period. So in your house, you might have a quilt or a painted chest, and of course, having a Masonic apron, it was just all part of that same culture, same style. And this one, the skill on this is very good. I think it must have been a professionally trained artist. Again, I unfortunately do not know anything about it. We purchased it at an auction and it didn't have any history about who owned it or where it came from. But it's a royal arch apron. You can see the king and the high priest and the scribe, and it's really, really well done, and again gives that fancy style. And the style kind of died out by the 1840s, the fancy style. Photography and industrialization really started to encourage an interest in more realistic art and decoration. And again, a couple more favorites. I think of these two aprons as biographical objects, which is an anthropological term about personally meaningful objects that take on a life of their own. And you can see they tell a story about their owners, but they also gained sentimental value as they were passed down in the family. The older of the two aprons belonged to Gideon Schofield. That is, this one is older. And he lived in New York State, near Saratoga. He ran a farm and got married but did not have any children. The apron spells out his Masonic activities, the name of his lodge, the dates of his degrees, and then also his Royal Arch degrees are on there too. And so the other one, this is a newer one, more recent apron, dates to 1911, and it was owned by Carl Leonard Lidfeldt. And he was initiated into all four bodies of the Scottish Rite. And so the apron is the one that was presented to him when he was raised a Master Mason. That information is under the flap. But then he had it painted with all the information about his Scottish Rite degrees. And I was very excited when I was researching this to find this photo in the museum's collection that is Lidfeldt's consistory class. And he is right about here. Very hard to see in the slide, but it was exciting to be able to put a face with the apron. And then, of course, in the US, there's been a lot of interest in Freemasonry in the Civil War, and we do have some aprons from the Civil War era. This one had an inscription that read, "Captured at the Battle of Logan's Field, Kentucky, January 19th, 1862, by M.D. Manson, commanding 2nd Brigade." So Mahlon Dickerson Manson, who was the M.D. Manson, was born in Ohio and became a Freemason. And he was promoted from captain to colonel when the Civil War started in 1861 and commanded part of the 10th Regiment, Indiana Infantry. And so when the Confederates attacked Union troops at Logan's Crossroads in 1862, which is referred to in the inscription, he was there as part of that battle. And ultimately, the Union troops were successful and pushed back the Confederates and also suffered about half as many casualties, 262, and the Confederates suffered 529. So after the war, Manson returned to his family in Indiana and was involved in politics, and he eventually was lieutenant governor of Indiana. It's likely that he found this apron during that battle while he was in Kentucky, and no one knew, of course, who it belonged to or who to give it back to or what to do with it. And so he took it home, and it was then passed down through 4 generations of his family before a family member gave it to the museum. This one has a similar story. It was also found during the Civil War, possibly in Louisiana. It's a little unclear. And it was part of a set of officer aprons that were, again, held onto by the family member who found them and passed down and then brought to the museum and given to us in 1998. So I have 2 more points to make. And I'm hoping that it will be a little bit of a call to action at the end to enlist some of you in my apron crusade. There are so many mystery aprons and aprons with mysteries still out there to be researched and studied. And I've mentioned some as we've gone along here that came to the museum without any history about when or where or who used them or made them. And the cover star from the book is in the same category. It was donated to the museum in 1994, but we don't know anything about where it came from or who made or owned it. However, in addition to looking good on a book cover, we can still learn from it. And what I like about this one is that it really reflects the beginning of the change to a standardized shape and design in the mid-1800s. So the apron itself has that square body and the triangular flap that we all know so well, but it also still has the hand-painted decoration and the silver trim that were popular on these older aprons that we've been looking at. And this is another mystery. I'm still haunted by this one. It sort of surrounds its use. It's a Scottish Rite apron. The flap shows a red Maltese cross with 33 in the center, suggesting that it was to be worn for the 33rd degree ritual or by a 33rd degree Scottish Rite member. But the eagle and the flags on the body relate to the encampment symbol used for the 32nd degree. And so again, we don't know who owned it or when it was used. I do know that during the late 1850s, the Supreme Council for the Northern Masonic Jurisdiction ordered new regalia from Paris. But the records don't give any information about material or design, just that it was difficult to conceive how it can be excelled in beauty of workmanship. This is where the curator says, no, give me something. Unfortunately, there was a big fire in 1964 at the Boston Masonic Building where the Supreme Council met and stored its regalia. And so the Supreme Council had to order new regalia to replace what it had lost. And so by May 1866, the regalia arrived from Paris and was described as rich and beautiful. Also not helpful. So it's really tempting to think that this might come from that source, that time period, but I don't have any evidence that, that we can say that for sure. There is one other apron that I know of that looks exactly like this one that is in the collection in The Hague at the Masonic Center Museum and Library in The Hague in the Netherlands. So it does start to, I think, okay, maybe it is European made, but that's about as far as I'll be able to go. And again, one more of my favorites, which is also a little bit of a mystery. And it does have an inscription that says, made in 1896, property of Irwin J. Roberts. I found out that Roberts was born in Redford, New York. And by 1894, he had moved to North Adams, Massachusetts, in the Berkshires. In 1896, the date that's on the apron, he joined the lodge in North Adams and presumably was purchased or was given this apron. It's really fantastic because each of these little symbols is metal, sheet metal. They're cut out of metal. I'm sorry you can't see them so well on the slide. They're engraved, a lot of them. Really nice work. Also very heavy. I don't think I'd want to wear it because it's much heavier than a lot of the aprons. But I don't know who made it, and I am so curious. I did have someone at a gallery talk when we had this on view come and tell me that a lot of the textile workers in that area of the Berkshires, when the textile manufacturing was going out, metalworking came in. So that's the best clue I have on that. I also think it has some relationship to the arts and crafts movement in England and America during the 1890s, during that late 1800s, early 1900s, which was a time of increased industrialization, and there was a value on fine workmanship like this. So I think it is still a product of its time. And it really does stand out in comparison to a lot of the mass-produced aprons from the period that were starting to get churned out in that square shape with the triangular flap with the blue border. And I'm going to end with a couple of examples about connections, because that was definitely the most rewarding part of this book and this project, was to find connections when I least expected it, which really inspired me to keep going. And it was great. I made connections between aprons and people, between history and other objects and Masonic aprons. This one, we purchased this in 2014 at an auction. And I was really excited because I'd never seen this printed design. I'd never seen it before. But again, there was no history with the apron. And I have a lot of people that say to me, how can you learn, where can you go from there? And I hope I've shown you sort of some of the places that even if you don't know anything about an object, it can teach us something. And so I had sort of put it aside and was waiting to catalog it. And then one day I was looking at certificate frames in the collection for a totally different project. And I came across one of the frames that had a certificate that was the same design. Same exact design. Yes, I was very excited. There might have been jumping up and down and screaming, but And even better, the certificate has a printed credit along the bottom. So it tells me that the certificate was produced by Robert McCoy, who, of course, ran a pretty big Masonic publishing house. Yes, many of you are nodding, in New York City. He was from Ireland, and he came to New York City and was a printer, and joined Freemasonry in 1848 in New York City. So I think I think this is a case where this one, I know I made a point about how apron makers often copied freely, but it looks like the same engraving plate, certificate, and apron. So I think it's a pretty good case that McCoy also sold aprons. These two also I was excited about. At the beginning of the book project, I went through the whole collection and I looked at every apron in the collection and I was pulling out ones I wanted to include. And I came across these two that clearly were related. And they had labels from the same maker, a man named Edgar Platt of Boston. And my interest was really piqued because I'd never heard of Edgar Platt, and I like to think I have heard of most Boston apron makers. So it was new to me. And so I did some research, and Platt had become a Freemason in New Jersey in 1860. By 1864, he moved to Massachusetts and had joined a lodge in the Boston area. And he was in the city directories for selling a wide range of military and fraternal goods, but he primarily identified himself as a hatter. And I was also really intrigued as I began to look into who owned these aprons, because they're both, lodge officer aprons. So they're not, the lodge would have bought them. It wouldn't have been an individual who bought and used and owned them. And so they were both gifts to the museum, one in 1975 when the museum first opened, and one in 1978. And in this case, we had good family history. And so the chaplain's apron had been owned by Edward George Graves, who worked as a tailor and as surveyor of the Port of Boston. And he joined East Boston's Baalbek Lodge in 1884. So keep that in mind. And then the treasurer's apron was owned by Charles Lindergreen, who was a furniture dealer, and he joined East Boston's Baalbek Lodge in 1887, just a few years after Edward Graves. So it seems likely that Baalbek Lodge at one time had an entire set of officer aprons that they had ordered from Edgar Platt in this design. So how Graves and Lindergreen came to own these aprons is a little bit of a mystery. Maybe they were souvenirs, maybe they were presented to the men after lodge service, maybe the lodge decided to buy new aprons, and these two men said, oh, I'm going to take this home rather than throw them away. All possibilities, but I'm glad to still have them because now we know about this maker, Edgar Platt, that we really hadn't had represented in our collection. So one more, just to finish up. And this apron shows a very distinctive design, and it was inspired by the frontispiece in a book called The Builder's Jewel, which is an English builder's guide by a man named Batty Lingley. It was first published in 1741, and the book went through 14 editions. And the design, which is a diminutive of Bartholomew, he designed it and his brother Thomas engraved it. And it was used repeatedly to decorate objects in England and America. And that was sort of the connection to see, okay, this apron with this very distinctive design, and then I would start seeing this design everywhere. You can see that the museum has mark metal in the collection that has the same design. There's also a Liverpool-style jug out there with this design, and a tracing board from a New York lodge that has the same design. And then the buck trout master's chair, which is fairly famous, it's down in Virginia, also has this illustration, uses this design, this kind of image. So this apron might have originally been used in Beverly, Massachusetts on the North Shore. It was purchased by the museum in 2000 and had been handed down in a particular family. So to conclude, there is still much history to learn from these aprons, and I hope my last few points and discoveries will encourage you to ask questions and to look at aprons differently. When I started the book, I was really happy to get more information published, but I also really wanted to encourage people to look at these objects with fresh eyes and start to make connections and add to their stories. So I hope that you will take some of this information away and be inspired to look into an apron or another Masonic object that might fascinate you. And my email is here, and again, as I mentioned at the beginning, the museum's website, which has lots of great online resources. So I really encourage you to take a look and ask questions and rethink those Masonic aprons in your life. Thank you very much.